August 1st, 1944, Nehou, Normandy, France. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when the orders reached the truck park that lay along a narrow farm track just north of the little town. Private First Class James Miller stood on the running board of his 2.5-ton cargo truck and checked the lashings on a pyramid of 5-gallon gasoline cans, the metal still damp with dew. He had driven ashore in late June and had hauled everything a fast-moving army could consume since that day. Wire, rations, blankets, artillery shells, and now almost nothing but fuel. Around him, engines coughed to life and settled into a steady thrum. Military police set out direction signs painted with a white circle and a red disc that looked like a traffic signal from home. The word had spread among drivers before any staff officer confirmed it. Third Army was active as of noon. General George S. Patton had his flag up. There would be a breakout to the south and then east, through Avranches and beyond the old Norman bocage. Miller rubbed a streak of grease from his sleeve and glanced toward the hedgerow gaps where the black-clad engineers had widened the lane at dawn. The line of trucks stretched so far that the rear was out of sight, a row of green hoods and white stars that seemed to run into the morning fog. He climbed into the cab, tapped the gauge, and felt the familiar knot in his stomach that came before every long haul. He had learned to manage fear the way he managed the clutch, steadily and without drama. What the Army needed from him today was simple to say and hard to do. Keep the convoy moving. Do not stop for anything short of a roadblock. Deliver the cans to the tankers who were already impatient. He thought about something he had heard attributed to Patton the week before, that men could eat belts if they had to, but tanks had to have gas. It sounded harsh when you said it flat, yet out here in the hedgerows, with the tracks of half-tracks and the grooves of tank treads carved into the earthen lanes, it felt like plain truth. He eased the truck into first gear and crept forward behind the tailgate of the next load. The battle that made these orders possible had begun in late July, when the American First Army tore a hole in the German line west of St. Lo. The code name was Cobra, an armored hammer that beat down on a front already weakened by weeks of bombardment. After days of aerial attack that shook the ground and churned fields into dust, infantry moved through the wreckage, and armored divisions found open ground where hedges had once forced a fight at 10 yards. By 31st July, the crossroads town of Avranches was in American hands, and a bridge over the Sélune near Pont-au-Beau carried streams of vehicles south. Third Army became active the next day, and at once began to fan out. The commander had been kept out of Normandy for weeks, while a deception plan made the enemy think he was somewhere else. Now his staff, his corps, and his divisions poured through the breach with a speed that shocked both friend and foe. At the same time, Hitler and his senior commanders argued about what to do. Some believed the American advance would burn itself out because no force could feed so many tanks and trucks across beaches and a handful of battered ports. Others wanted a counterattack toward Avranches to cut the growing spearhead. That counterattack came a week later around Mortagne, where German units tried to drive to the sea. It failed under the weight of American artillery and fighter bombers that hunted columns along the lanes. While that was happening, Allied formations pivoted east and then north in a broad arc that threatened to close a trap around German forces retreating from lower Normandy. The pocket that formed between Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois in the middle of August became a graveyard of vehicles. Tens of thousands of prisoners stumbled rearward past burned-out half-tracks, guns abandoned in ditches, and carts piled with whatever could be saved. The scale of the retreat created an image of sudden victory. The truth was more complicated. The farther the armies drove, the longer every supply mile became. Allied planners had expected a slower fight through the hedgerows and had intended to build up depots around the beaches and Cherbourg for a deliberate advance. Instead, the front leaped ahead. The numbers that governed victory were not only divisions, tanks, and guns. They were also tonnage per day, gallons of gasoline per mile, and the rate at which roads could bear the weight of trucks. Those numbers would decide whether the momentum that Cobra created could be turned into a deep pursuit across France. Miller felt those numbers in the ache of his hands and the grit against his teeth when the convoy finally rolled out of the field and onto the narrow macadam. The lead vehicles carried flags that marked the route. MPs took up posts at bends and crossroads, whistling and circling gloved hands to keep the line tight. There was no talking once they were on the move, only short gestures and the occasional blast of a horn when a civilian cart drifted too close. He did his arithmetic the way drivers do it, by comparing the gauge to the miles and the sound of the engine to the feel of the road. The early part of the run wound through lanes still walled by hedgerows. The air smelled of crushed nettles and hot oil. Now and then he saw the raw earth of fresh graves at the edge of a field, marked with a helmet on a rifle or a wooden cross with a penciled name. Around Coutances, the roads opened a little, and he passed the hulks of tanks, some German, some American, that had been burned out only days before. He kept his eyes on the back of the truck ahead and let the blur of war slide past his side window. The discipline of the convoy mattered more than what was on either verge. Once in a while he caught a glimpse of the sea in the distance, and lines of ships anchored under a summer haze, the lifeline that made all of this movement possible. The route planners favored loops that kept traffic in one direction. Loaded trucks went out on one marked road, empty ones returned on another. Somewhere behind him, a wrecker and a maintenance team stood ready to pull a broken vehicle into a lay-by so the line would not stall. He had been told again and again that the most dangerous thing the Germans could do to them now was not an ambush, but a delay that idled engines and burned gas that could not be spared. When the convoy crossed the bridge at Pont-au-Beau, he glanced down at the saloon and saw engineers working under the span, bracing timbers and checking bolts, while a stream of armor worked through from the far bank. The tankers were not patient. He saw one crewman sitting on the turret of a Sherman with a signboard scrawled in chalk that read simply, "Gasoline." The soldier lifted the sign as they rolled past, a joke made from urgency. Miller stared straight ahead and kept his speed steady. He felt the weight of cans behind him with every rise and every turn and listened to the engine note the way a farmer listens for weather. He did not need a map to know that his world that day was a ribbon of road measured in miles and in time between halts. To understand what it meant for a long line of trucks to creep across Normandy in the first days of August, you have to step back from Miller's window and look at the map of northern France with the cold detail of a logistics officer. The lodgment the Allies carved on the coast in June was fed by beaches and the small harbors they had seized at a cost already measured in white crosses. The big port of Cherbourg fell in late June, but the German garrison wrecked its facilities, and the engineers who labored to repair it could not conjure deep water capacity overnight. One of the two artificial harbors built for the invasion had been blown apart by a fierce storm in late June. British forces kept the other one operating at Arromanches, yet even that marvel could not solve every problem for an army that now had to move at the pace of an open road. The Americans compensated with improvisation. They pushed supply inland along the ancient road net with trucks. They built forward depots around St. Lo and then farther south and east as the front moved. Requirements grew with every mile gained. Planners had assumed that by late summer, the Allied armies would need around 20,000 tons per day across the northern France front. In reality, the hunger of engines and the appetite of fast-moving divisions made even that figure feel thin. Fuel was the heart of the problem. Gasoline arrived in cans and in bulk, and in these weeks much of it still came forward in the hands of men like Miller, who wrestled 5-gallon tins off tailgates and stacked them for armored crews to break open with hammers. German intelligence officers and senior commanders had long argued that the invasion force would not be able to sustain momentum once it left the beaches. They had seen their own supply system buckle under bombing and under the strain of the Eastern Front. They judged the invaders by their own limits and expected the road net to choke and the depots to empty. What they failed to account for was the scale of the American motor pool and the willingness to organize entire roads for nothing but traffic flow. In late August, a dedicated truck corridor would receive a name that every driver in northern France learned by heart. It would run day and night, staffed by thousands, and at its peak it would move more than 10,000 tons in a single day. The men who drove it would be mostly Black Americans who had trained as service troops and now found themselves at the core of victory. Before that corridor had a name, however, the work had already begun, a continuous hum of engines that joined beaches to battlefields. Patton had spoken bluntly about priorities, and his words became practical orders. Tanks did not advance on speeches. They advanced on gasoline measured in millions of gallons. It was a simple truth that no contempt from an enemy headquarters could erase, and it would be tested across the breadth of France in the weeks that followed. Miller learned the names of places the way a driver learns them, by the feel of the surface under the tires and the way the engine breathes on a climb. In the second week of August, his route bent south around Avranches and then east toward Le Mans, where armor had already pushed through and left only the groan of wreckers and the tap of engineers' hammers behind. He slept in the cab when he could, one hand near the stick and the other under his jacket, and woke to the bang of a tailgate or the short call of an MP who was moving them out. The men lined up and counted cans off the bed with a rhythm that saved words. He could tell an armored battalion's mood by the speed of those hands, quick and sure when the fighting was moving, slow and silent when they had been hit hard and were waiting for replacements. At a crossroads near Mayenne, he handed a ration tin to a tanker who had chalked "Please Fuel" on the side of his Sherman turret. The man grinned and said they were headed for the Sarthe bridges, and then he was gone in a spray of dust and a shout to his driver. The roads were already scarred from weeks of fighting. Bridges had been dropped and then patched with heavy timber and steel. Engineers stood calf-deep in cold water beneath spans, bolting girders while convoys rattled overhead. Civilians waited at the verges with bicycles and carts, some with small flags tucked into their belts, some with nothing but the clothes they wore and a hunger that showed in their faces. In the villages, the women shouted "Vive," and the children ran after the trucks until an MP waved them back. In the fields, the farmers kept working, heads bent over rows that had to be brought in before the weather turned. In the cab, Miller kept the needle in the green and watched the tailboard ahead. He knew that a stop would stretch a mile in minutes, and a mile meant more gas burned for nothing. He took his food where he could, bread and a slice of cheese, coffee from a dented can held over a small burner, and felt his heart jump each time a fighter swept over at tree height. He learned to sleep through the noise of a depot yard by thinking about the sound of home, the wind in the cottonwoods behind his father's shed in Kansas, and the way the old Ford on the farm had coughed into life on cold mornings. He did not write often, but when he did, he told his sister he was fine, and that his truck had a mind of its own. He did not tell her that he could smell burned rubber and cordite on some stretches, or that he had begun to count the wrecks he passed without meaning to, as if there were a tally that mattered to no one but him. The work had a strange calm to it. He could not see the battle in the way the infantry saw it, but he felt the pull of it all the same. A steady tug through his hands on the wheel that said hurry without anger and without panic. Deliver. Turn. Load. Repeat. The miles added up in the logbook, and he came to understand that numbers were as real as any hill or river. If he could keep his place in the line and make his drop, something large moved forward that had no face and yet rested on the hands of men who drove and lifted and checked the lashings before dawn. The sweep of events around him was large and grim, and it was measured with simple numbers as well as hard names. In the first week of August, German forces tried to cut the American spearhead that had pushed through to Avranches. The attempt around Mortain ran from the 7th through the 12th and brought armored clashes on narrow roads and under a sky patrolled by fighter bombers. Radio calls sent groups of aircraft to the front faster than German armor could shake out into line. The counterattack failed, and as it staggered back, Allied units wheeled east and north. Between the 13th and the 21st, a trap began to close between Falaise, Argentan, and Chambois. Corps and divisions that had fought in Normandy since June tried to pull out on roads choked with carts and trucks. Prisoners came in by the thousand. The number grew each day, and by the time the pocket was sealed and then reduced, the totals would run into the tens of thousands. In the same days, the debate within the German command turned from whether the Americans could sustain a pursuit to how to save what could be saved from Lower Normandy. Many officers had been sure that the Americans would slow for lack of fuel and for lack of repair capacity. They pointed to the destruction of Cherbourg's port and to the loss of one of the artificial harbors in the great storm that hit in late June. They noted how many bridges had been dropped and how few rail lines still worked within range of the front. They believed that the invaders would need months to bring major ports forward, and that until then, any thrust beyond the hedgerow country would run on a thin line that smart blows could cut. What they did not grasp was the degree to which the Americans intended to substitute roads and trucks for rails and ports, and how many trucks they could throw at a problem. By mid-August, 2 United States field armies and their support used hundreds of thousands of vehicles of all kinds, from jeeps to tank retrievers. The core cargo hauler was the 2.5-ton truck, a simple, robust machine that could carry food, shells, and cans of gasoline over roads that would have stranded a rail car and that would have wrecked a heavier lorry. An armored division on the move could drink more than 100,000 gallons in a day. A single corps in pursuit could swallow 1 million gallons in a week. Third Army now had several armored divisions and several infantry divisions fanning across a front that broadened by the day. The basic fact of Allied strength, that factories across the Atlantic could produce engines, tires, and spare parts in quantities that dwarfed anything the enemy could match, met the basic fact of French geography, that a web of roads, many narrow but many passable, could be marked and kept clear by disciplined traffic control. Commanders who scoffed at American logistics had been shaped by their own experience, where railheads were sacred and where bombing could break a line for weeks. They now watched an opponent move tons of supply from beaches to forward depots with a motion that looked like a city at rush hour. In late August, that movement received a name and a set of rules that made it even faster. It was not magic. It was men, fuel, tires, and a map. Miller heard the name first from an MP who was pinning a round-painted sign to a post at dawn. The guard tapped the red disc with his knuckle and said, "This route is red ball now," That meant a road reserved for heavy trucks. No civilian traffic, no sightseeing, no stopping except at designated points, with a return route marked separately to keep the flow clean. The start line was inland of the beaches around Saint-Lô, and the first leg carried cargo to Chartres, then farther toward Paris, and then on to depots that fed Patton's long reach across the Seine toward Troyes, Chalon-sur-Marne, and the Meuse. The rules were simple: drive with lights hooded at night, keep intervals tight, pass only when ordered, obey MPs without question. Mechanics set up in laybys with tool chests and spare tires ready to pull a truck out of line and push it back in after a fast fix. Gasoline for the haulers was staged along the verge, and the drivers learned to top off whenever they were told. The line never slept. When he was on the route, Miller saw the same faces more than once, men from quartermaster companies drawn from across the states, and he began to notice how many of the hands that steadied a jack or signaled a pass were dark. Units of black drivers made up the bulk of the route, and their companies often shouldered the longest legs with little rest. In a depot near Chartres, he watched a sergeant from one of those companies check an axle with practiced eyes, call for a part, and get a truck that smelled of hot gear oil back into the stream in 20 minutes. The chalked tally board outside the tent told its own story by the end of the day. Hundreds of vehicles in, hundreds out, almost all moving again within the hour. The motto that passed from truck to truck was simple: keep them rolling. He took it to heart because he had seen what a halt did to the men waiting at the far end, men who ran their own engines while they waited for fuel. One night on the outskirts of Paris, he climbed down from his cab to stretch while the column idled at a checkpoint. He could see a faint glow to the north where the city lay. He knew that resistance fighters and Free French troops had been battling inside the capital, and that Allied units were now moving through. And for a moment, he thought about walking to the rise to see if he could catch a glimpse of the skyline. He did not move. The MP made a small motion with his hand that meant climb back in. When a march column is running, sightseeing is a crime. The same night, a line of ambulances slid by on the return route, their red crosses just visible. He looked down at his hands on the wheel and thought again of the farm and the way his father had taught him to fix the water pump by listening for a change in pitch. He had come to understand that a convoy had a pitch of its own, a hum that meant the flow was right. When the hum broke, trouble grew. So he watched the tail lamps ahead and kept his foot steady and did not think about the city lights. When he finally turned off into a forward park beyond Troyes, a tanker crew was already waiting, helmets askew and eyes bright with impatience. He saw a corporal raise a can and say, "Make it quick. We are halfway to the Meuse and not stopping." Miller nodded, and for the next hour the only sounds were the clank of metal on metal and the short words that move heavy things without waste. The larger canvas that framed his work in late August and in the first days of September showed an army that had burst across the Seine on several crossings, one near Mantes, another near Melun, another near Montereau, and then had poured through the open country of Champagne on roads where dust lifted in long sheets under the late summer sun. Paris fell on the 25th after uprisings inside the city and a thrust by Allied columns that included the French 2nd Armored Division. To the east, the German High Command tried to form new lines on the Marne and then on the Meuse. Command passed in mid-August to a new field marshal after his predecessor was recalled. The man who took command faced a front that ran thin and a trail of wreckage that ran thick. He counted on delay from distance as much as on the fire of new units. Every mile of pursuit cost the pursuer fuel and worn rubber. The Allied staffs counted those costs with care, and they adjusted daily. They created the Red Ball Corridor on the 25th with 2 roads, one out and one back, marked at every turn, policed at every junction. And they fed it with truck companies at a scale that made a logistics officer's heart glad. At the start, over 100 truck companies were assigned. Within weeks, the number of vehicles on the route ran into the thousands. At its peak in early September, the corridor could carry more than 10,000 tons in a day. The drivers were rotated, but many ran on coffee and hard bread and nerve. Reports in early September recorded that 3/4 of the drivers were Black Americans who worked under white officers and who carried out one of the most important tasks of the campaign without fanfare and with few breaks. Third Army's advance reflected that effort. Troyes fell on the 25th, Reims on the 30th, Verdun on the 31st. By the last day of August, leading elements were across the Meuse at Commercy and at Saint-Mihiel. The speed of the pursuit astonished observers who had expected pauses for rail repair and for the opening of major ports. Yet numbers have a habit of catching up. The farther the reach, the wider the front, and the longer the haul. In the first days of September, fuel and ammunition allocations tightened. Staff tables for daily needs showed hundreds of thousands of gallons required and fewer than that available, and the equation meant that hard choices would arrive. A famous line attributed to Patton in these days put the matter in words that any driver understood. "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He did not mean that infantry would go hungry. He meant that supply must serve maneuver at the decisive point. The calculus of tons and miles would soon force pauses at the Moselle and before Metz, while to the north, British and Canadian armies strained toward Antwerp and the Scheldt. German generals who had dismissed American logistics as a soft belly were looking now at a stream of trucks that had crossed a country in a month and had kept armor moving across 3 rivers. They were not wrong to say the stream could not flow forever without a deeper harbor and a fixed rail net, but they had been wrong about the near term. The convoy did storm through France, and it did so because 1,000 small acts kept it from stalling. A can lifted, a tire changed in the dark, a bridge braced at midnight, a route sign hammered into a post at dawn. The arithmetic of pursuit had been turned in favor of the side that could move more steel and more food and more fuel to where it needed to be on the day it needed to be there. In that arithmetic lay the secret of the next stage of the campaign. The men like Miller felt that truth in their bones and in the ache of their hands as September opened and the road turned toward the Moselle. Miller felt the change in the weather before he saw it. On the first days of September, the sky over the Moselle was a bright blue that lifted dust in long veils behind every truck. By the end of the week, the air turned heavy, and the smell of rain mixed with the scent of canvas and hot gear oil. He came off the Red Ball route near Commercy at night, followed a string of hooded lamps over the road crown, and rolled down toward a river that he knew only from the map sheet that an MP had shown him, a sine curve through orchards and low hills with the name Moselle printed along its bend. Engineers had already staked approaches and laid cribbing where soft shoulders could swallow a wheel. Somewhere upstream, an infantry division kept a small and dangerous foothold on the east bank. Somewhere downstream, another had failed to hold and had come back under fire. Miller did not read operations orders, but he learned what he needed to know from the traffic in front of him and the nervous urgency of the men at the receiving point. He tied a scarf around his neck against the night chill, eased the clutch, and walked the truck forward at a crawl until a corporal with a flashlight brought his palm up, then circled a finger that meant offload now. Gasoline cans went down in fast rows, a chain of hands that kept the tailgate clear while a squad leader called the count. When one stack toppled on wet planks, he jumped back in time and then reached out again without thinking. There was no anger at the spill, only a steady motion that carried cans from steel to earth and then onto a waiting trailer. He heard machine gun fire crack far off through the low cloud and wondered if it was on their side of the river or the far bank. A shell came in somewhere to the north and burst with a thud that made men look up without stopping. When the bed was empty, he checked the lashings for the return run, pulled his gloves off with his teeth, and sat for a moment, with both hands on the wheel, feeling for the hum that meant the column was alive again. A maintenance truck eased past to the verge where a hauler sat, with a flat tire, and a sapper knelt beside a jack. The rain began just before dawn, soft at first, then a steady patter that turned dust to paste and paste to mud. When he crossed the repaired span on the way back, he glanced left and saw water pushed hard under the pilings and men in ponchos bent to check straps that kept timbers from working loose. He thought of the small creek behind his father's house in Kansas and how it had risen after a late summer storm. And he realized that this river would decide what infantry and armor could do for days to come. It would decide how far he would drive, how long he would idle in line, and whether a day's labor would end in a drop or a return to the depot with a full load because something upstream had failed. He lit a cigarette, took 2 pulls, and pinched it out to save the rest. He did not talk about fear in his letters. He talked about the way trucks sounded different on a wooden bridge in the rain, and how the smell of wet rope stayed in the cab after an offload. He wrote that the French farmers were bringing in apples and that he had traded a bar of chocolate for 2 that tasted like a memory of home. The story around him in those first 2 weeks of September was wide and exact in its dates and measures. Third Army had burst across the Meuse at the end of August and had driven on in a broad fan that ran from Verdun to the old salient around Saint-Mihiel, with bridgeheads that formed and failed as divisions tested the Moselle. At Dornot on the 8th, a small force crossed under fire and clung to the east bank for 2 days without reinforcement, then came back under assaults that left the ground on the far side littered with torn webbing and empty helmets. At Arneville on the 10th, the 5th Infantry Division found a better crossing, built it under a shield of smoke and artillery, and then endured counterattacks that fell with weight and then faded as German units discovered that the bridge would not fall. Nancy lay to the south and would be taken by mid-month after sharp fighting west and south of the city. Metz lay to the north and east and would prove a harder nut than any map suggested. A ring of forts built in the 19th century and strengthened in the years since that could pour fire across the river and into any approach route. German commanders, reeling from the collapse in Normandy and the loss of Paris on the 25th of August, tried to restore coherence on the line of the Moselle and farther back on the line of the Saar. They counted on the river, the forts, and the weather. Allied staffs counted gallons, tons, and the fact that a captured port at Antwerp on the 4th of September could not yet be used because the enemy still held the estuary seaward of the city. That meant that through September, the main weight of supply still came over the Normandy beaches and through Cherbourg, both at the end of a long motor road that wore men and tires down. The Red Ball corridor that had opened on the 25th of August kept its promise through the first half of September. 2 marked routes, one outbound and one for the return, ran from the Saint-Lô area through Chartres and on toward Paris, and then east to feed depots near Reims, Troyes, and Chalon-sur-Marne. Military police stood at every important turn. Repair teams worked from laybys to pull haulers back into the stream, and fuel points topped off trucks so that the route itself did not starve the vehicles that fed it. At its peak, the corridor shifted more than 10,000 tons in a day. Over the life of the operation, it would carry hundreds of thousands of tons. 3 out of 4 drivers on the route were Black Americans who had trained for service duties and now shouldered a task that kept entire field armies in motion. The farther the front reached, the tighter the arithmetic became. Armored division on the move could consume more than 100,000 gallons in a day. A corps in pursuit could use 1,000,000 gallons in a week. Tires wore, engines heated, bridges needed shoring, and every mile of advance added a mile to the haul. Across the channel, planners pushed more fuel ashore, some in cans, some in bulk, and they laid overland pipelines in France to carry gasoline forward as fast as engineers could place and protect them. A pipeline under the sea toward Cherbourg would add capacity later, but in these weeks, the bulk still rode on steel and rubber. In the middle of the month, a new demand rose to the north with an airborne operation that would try to leap the lower Rhine. That bid would draw fuel toward First Army and toward British forces. It would mean hard choices for Third Army. In the same days, the German command tried a different answer near Nancy and Aricourt. They moved fresh armored brigades forward and bet that fog and rain would blunt Allied air and that a rush against tired American formations could open the line. The battle that followed would show how thin the enemy had become and how ready American tankers and gunners were to meet them in close country. It would also show how the flow of trucks and cans toward a few road hubs kept divisions in the line from failing when the sky closed in. On the 15th, Miller came off a night run near Toul and found a short line of tents set against a hedge. A cook ladled coffee into a dented cup and told him to drink while it was hot. A corporal from a maintenance detachment squinted at his rear tires and ran a hand along a sidewall where a cut had grown longer than it should have. The fix would mean a delay unless the spare could be swapped in time to keep his place. The young man with the wrench had the tire off in minutes, and the sergeant who watched him gave Miller a look that told him to move again now. The sound of guns came across the fields from the east in long rolls that pushed through the low cloud. He saw a battery of self-propelled artillery parked under netting in an orchard. The crews sat on ammo boxes and smoked in the damp, while a staff sergeant in a slicker checked fuses under a tarp. At a crossroad west of Nancy, a line of tank destroyers eased out. Their long barrels canted toward the verge, as if they were listening. When Miller reached the offload, a tanker with grease up to his elbows tapped the tailgate with a ring and said we need it all. He did not look up from the stack he was building on a trailer. The rain deepened and the ground went soft under men who carried 40 pounds of gasoline in each hand. A spill made the air sharp in the nose and sent a wet shine across planks. 2 men slipped and rose without swearing and went back to the rhythm of lift and set. When the last can hit the bed of the trailer, a lieutenant with a map case tucked under his arm leaned in and said, "There is word of a push by the enemy east of here. Fog on the low, ground, and we are braced." He did not say anything about numbers or unit names. He did not need to. The sense of preparation lay in the way drivers were waved back to the road without chatter, and in the way a bulldozer idled near a culvert that might wash out if the rain kept on. Miller drove away with the wipers knocking a slow metronome on the glass and felt the odd quiet that comes when every man knows that the next day will be heavy. He slept that evening in the cab with his jacket over his chest and woke twice to the burst of artillery that made the truck body vibrate as if it were a drum. Before dawn, he ate a heel of bread and a square of chocolate, swallowed coffee that steamed in the damp air, and watched a column of ambulances pass going the other way. The driver of the first raised 2 fingers in a small salute and Miller answered with a short nod that was not quite a prayer and not quite a promise. The day brought him back to the same offload point, and the same men were there with the same demand for speed. A private who could not have been 20 years old took a can in each hand and said quietly that the enemy tanks were out there in the fog and that their own battalion had chopped a dozen in a morning at close range. He smiled once, a narrow flash that did not quite reach his eyes, and then he shouldered past with his load. In the late afternoon, a major with an oil-stained sleeve told Miller to take his empty truck to a nearby ammunition park and to bring back small arms boxes instead of fuel because the line had to be fed both ways today. In the park, he saw crate on crate under tarps and a line of men with clipboards counting outgoing loads with the same care he had seen at the gasoline point. The paperwork felt like a comfort. Numbers written in pencil on a damp sheet were a way of saying that chaos had not won. At dusk he came back over the same bridge, watched a sapper check a brace with a gloved hand, and knew that someone would stand there in the rain all night just to be sure it held. The canvas of those days is well known to anyone who reads the reports and the maps and the memoirs of the men who fought them, yet it lives most clearly in the numbers and in a few plain place names. From the 18th through the 29th of September, the area east and southeast of Nancy became a killing ground for German armor. The enemy sent forward new panzer brigades that had been raised in haste during the summer and thrown into action with little training together, their crews brave, their commanders energetic, their cohesion brittle. They came on in fog and low cloud that grounded most Allied air, and they struck American tank and infantry forces that had dug in on good ground. The formations that took the shock were from the 4th Armored Division and from supporting units with tank destroyers and artillery that knew how to find targets in close country. Combat commands under leaders who had learned their trade the hard way at Normandy and in the breakout used the folds of the land and the hedgerows to let enemy tanks show their flanks and then took them under fire at ranges that shocked crews used to open steppes in the east. Reports for the period vary in detail, as any reports do, yet the balance is unmistakable. The Americans lost scores of tanks and tank destroyers. The Germans lost several times that number. Many accounts credit the battle around Ericourt and on the ridges near Lezy and Juvilliers with the destruction of more than 200 German tanks and assault guns in less than 2 weeks, for the loss of a few dozen American vehicles. The ground favored the defender, and the weather kept the sky closed in the morning. But as the days wore on and the fog burned away, fighter bombers came down to add their weight, and columns that had been hit once at close range found themselves pounded from above. In the same period, the crossings at Arneville held and grew. Nancy was secured by mid-month. Metz did not fall. The ring of forts that guarded the city still looked across the river with their guns and forced attacks to grind. Fuel that had been ample enough for the rush across the Seine grew tight. On the 17th in the north, a great airborne lift opened a bid to outflank the German line in the Netherlands. That effort drew supply priority at a time when there was not enough of anything to feed every hungry engine. Third Army's advance slowed. Troops dug in along the Moselle. Engineers built and rebuilt approaches that rain turned to soup. The Red Ball still ran and still moved thousands of tons a day, yet the distance it had to cover and the wear of weeks of continuous movement began to show. Truck companies reported high rates of tire wear and a growing list of engines that needed overhaul. Units rotated drivers but could not conjure rest hours that matched the need. In October, the rain would come harder, and the ground around Metz would turn from firm to heavy. German commanders who had laughed in June at the notion that an American army could feed itself across beaches and fields now faced the fact that a stream of trucks had carried that army from Normandy to the Moselle in barely 1 month. They looked at a front that held because Allied supply had not failed, and that would only grow stronger as ports came online and rail lines were repaired. They took cold comfort in the thought that the invader had finally been forced to pause. The pause would not last. The lesson of the weeks since Avranches was simple and could be stated in the dry language of a staff memorandum or in the grease under the fingernails of a driver. Movement in modern war is a matter of fuel, tires, bridges, and men to move them. Where those exist in quantity, generals can be bold. Where they run short, even the best plan waits. Miller put that truth into practice without ever saying the words. He kept the needle in the green, kept the gap to the tailboard correct, took what sleep he could, and returned again to the river with whatever his manifest told him to carry. The convoy had stormed through France through August. In September, it learned how to hold a line, feed a battle, and wait for the day when the order would come to push again. The names in his log for the month told the same story in another language. Commercy, Toul, Nancy, Pont-à-Mousson, Arneville, Metz. Each entry was a measure of how far a truck had carried the weight of an army and how close the work of a driver stood to the thin edge where armor and infantry traded blows in fog and rain. Miller felt October in his bones before he saw it on the calendar. The air over Lorraine turned cold and wet, and the road dust he had breathed in August became a gray paste that worked into the tread of his boots and into the seams of the canvas on the cab doors. He left a forward park near Toul before dawn and followed a string of hooded lamps to a checkpoint where an MP with a whistle sent him left toward a bridge approach that engineers had shored with heavy timber. The river under that span ran with a brown push that spoke of rain in the hills. Men in ponchos checked lashings by touch and called counts in low voices that carried no urgency and no fear, only a steady will to keep the line moving. At the offload near the Moselle, a corporal with grease on his cheeks tapped the tailgate with a ring and said, "Bring them down fast," then turned without waiting for an answer and passed a can along a chain of hands that led to a waiting half-track. Miller stepped down into mud that took his heel and held it for a heartbeat before letting go. Gasoline had a strong scent in wet air, and it mixed with the smell of cold metal and wool. Far off, a dull thud told of guns feeling for each other in the mist. He hauled, stacked, counted in his head, and learned again the short language of work that saves breath and time. When the bed was clear, he wiped his hands on a rag that was already black and climbed back into the cab to wait for the line to lurch forward. Across the way, a maintenance team had a truck on a jack with a wheel off, and a young black sergeant was guiding a wrench on a stubborn nut, while his driver held a lamp close to the hub. The rhythm of their talk was unhurried and exact. "You got it. Now pull. Good. Back in. Move." The truck dropped from the jack and rolled into the stream as if it had never left, and the sergeant gave Miller a short nod that felt like a salute between men who shared the same ledger of miles and repairs. He ate when he could, bread that broke into rough crumbs, a tin of meat that tasted of salt more than anything else, coffee that came from a dented pot and warmed his hands more than his throat. When he wrote home, he told his sister that the country looked like Kansas when the leaves turned color, and that the people had begun to save apples in baskets under sheds. He did not write about the assault he had heard had gone wrong at a fort near Metz, or about the way cold worked up through the floor of the cab when he slept with his jacket as a blanket, or about the small fear that came with every new approach to a bridge that creaked under ton after ton in the rain. He told simple things. "The roads have names I can barely say. The men at the drop are always waiting. Engines sound different on wet wood. The shape of the fight around him in October was written in dates, rivers, and tonnage, and it turned on the stubborn ring of works that guarded Metz as much as on any division in the open field. After the rush across France in August and the violent checks and counters around Nancy in September, Third Army pushed at the Moselle and at the forts outside Metz and learned that autumn rain and concrete could bleed speed from any plan. At Dornot, a small bridgehead taken on the 8th of September had been pulled back under hard counterattacks. At Arneville, a crossing on the 10th, held and grew under smoke and artillery and steady work by engineers. Those footholds became the base for the November effort that would finally take the city. In October, an assault on Fort Driant failed at great cost after infantry fought across wet slopes against guns that had been sighted in peace and improved in war. The Grey Ring of Metz commanded the river lines and the roads, and its casemates threw fire across the approaches with a patience learned over decades. German field commanders, who had watched the Americans fly across France in a month, found in Lorraine a set of natural and built defenses that could be held if the enemy paused for breath. They counted on weather, on broken rail lines, and on distance. Allied staffs answered with arithmetic and invention. Red Ball Express had opened on the 25th of August with 2 marked roads for outbound and return traffic, and with a rule set that gave trucks the right of way and gave military police the authority to turn any intersection into a one-way channel. In its first weeks, the corridor carried thousands of tons each day from depots near Saint-Lô and the beaches to Chartres, to Paris, and then east toward Reims, Troyes, and Chalon-sur-Marne. By early September, daily lifts could exceed 10,000 tons, and across the life of the route through mid-November, the total would run above 400,000 tons, carried by thousands of trucks, driven mostly by Black Americans, whose companies kept the engines in motion day and night. In the same period, pipelines moved fuel forward across Normandy and into northern France, and an undersea line to Cherbourg began to add capacity in late summer, while another to the Pas de Calais came on in the autumn. Ports captured in September, such as Le Havre and Rouen, began to reopen in stages after heavy damage. Rail lines were repaired mile by mile and pushed forward from the beaches and from Cherbourg to Paris and eastward to Reims, but through October, the truck lanes still bore the lion's share of the load for Patton's front. Antwerp, seized on the 4th of September, could not yet receive ships because the Scheldt estuary remained in German hands. British and Canadian formations would spend October and early November clearing that waterway in a sequence of stubborn fights on dikes and islands. Until that job was done, the Great Harbor stood as a promise rather than a solution. The result for Third Army was a careful rationing of gallons and shells. Staff tables showed what could go forward each day and what could not. Orders went out that used short phrases that drivers learned by heart. No halts on grades, no unnecessary idling, pass only on signal. At the same time, the enemy tried to redesign the battle by throwing new armor at the thin mist near Nancy and Aricourt. That bid failed with heavy loss in late September. October brought a change of pace rather than a collapse. The German First Army defended the Moselle and the forts with skill and used rain and broken ground to make every mile expensive. Predictions made in the summer by German officers that American supply would fail when it reached beyond the first 100 miles inland proved wrong in the main, but not foolish in the short term. The stream of trucks had reached Lorraine, and it did not stop, yet it could not run at the easy tempo of August. The convoy that had stormed through France now learned the discipline of wet roads and slow bridges and of a city that had been built to be held. Miller learned that discipline with each turn of the wheel. On some days, the red ball signs gave way to local route markers as traffic control pushed him onto short legs that fed a few main bridges and a handful of road hubs. He came to know the smell of wet rope, wet wood, and wet canvas, as well as the smell of gasoline and hot oil. He watched engineers by lantern light drive new cribbing under a span while trucks rolled by inches away. He learned the way a river sounds at night when rain is on it, and how that sound can be a measure of danger, a quiet rush when the level is steady, a deep push when water rises against the supports. At a forward park near Pont, a Mousson, he stood in a short line for coffee, while a maintenance corporal ran his hand along the tread of a spare and shook his head and called for a swap. The man spoke in a flat tone that seemed beyond tired and beyond panic. "This one will not take a pothole. Bring me that one with the chalk mark." On the same day, a captain from the quartermaster company read out a change to the manifest at the last moment and added small arms boxes to the load because infantry at the river bend had burned through ammunition in the last 24 hours. Miller nodded and checked the straps and drove out into early evening with the rain fine as dust and constant on the windshield. Along the verge, he passed a line of ambulances with their lights hooded and their drivers sitting very straight, and he looked away without meaning to and counted the beats between the posts. In a village near the river, a woman held a child under a shawl and lifted a hand as the trucks went by. In a lane outside a farm, a group of prisoners in field gray walked with their heads down and their hands in pockets, while a guard from a service company walked a few paces behind with his rifle at the carry. The convoy stopped for a moment at a bend where trees closed over the road. An MP with a whistle blew once and swung his arm forward. The line moved again. At the offload, he found tanker crews waiting with helmets pushed back and wrenches ready. One of them had chalked the word gasoline on a piece of crateboard and held it up with a grin that had no humor in it, a small shield against the fact that their tanks would not move without what he carried. The cans clanked, the stacks grew, the men worked without wasted motion. He thought again of a thing he had heard a staff officer say in August at a depot near Chartres. "Keep them rolling." In October, that phrase was not a motto. It was a law. He slept in the cab that night with his jacket over his chest and his feet in the footwell, and dreamed of the sound of the old Ford on the farm in Kansas, swallowing a hill on second gear. He woke to the sound of rain again, to the smell of fuel again, and to a new set of orders that sent him back to the same bridge and the same bend in the river. At noon, the clouds thinned, and for an hour the sky opened, and he saw a pair of fighter bombers slide across the gray and drop toward the east with a quick roar. Men in the yard looked up and did not cheer. They watched without speaking, and then went back to work. In the evening, he traded a bar of chocolate for an apple that tasted of wet leaves. He ate it slowly and thought of the way the wind sounded in the cottonwoods behind the shed at home. He did not write that night. He slept and woke and drove. The broader record of October and early November set his private miles inside a line of events that would decide whether the scoffs heard in enemy headquarters in the summer had any truth left in them. While Third Army marked and repaired approaches, and while infantry tested the edges of Metz, the logistic picture shifted under the strain and then began to improve. Red Ball Express still counted thousands of movements each day, but planners began to shift more tonnage to rail as lines east from Paris reopened and as repair crews pushed the steel across the Marne and toward Reims and Chalon. Ports taken in September began to pass cargo in larger numbers. Rouen came back sooner. Le Havre followed, damaged but useful. The undersea pipeline to Cherbourg added steady flow that removed some pressure from the can traffic.